Once a year, a blackguard writes an article with the headline, "Poetry is the new rock and roll."
2015 celebrates the year poetry actually became as cool, if not cooler, than rock and roll, gate-crashing the stage with a new type of performer.
We can rampage till we stand strange. Right now we got our hands chained, clutching at freedom. You know, the freedom of mean what you say and say it with meaning.
This fresh, direct style of performance has its roots in one of the biggest revolutions to transform poetry and popular culture.
I am that worm soul under the heel of the demon horses.
Half a century ago, 60s beat poets re-energized one of our oldest traditions, words spoken aloud. And poetry performed.
A glass of warm blood and then straight up the stairs. Batman and Robin are saying their prayers.
Sung. Ranted.
And as the bastions crash and fall, here comes the greatest blow of all. It took a long time to deduce, but Reagan's really Lenny Bruce.
Turned pop stars into poets.
If I hadn't been a Beatle, I just wouldn't have thought of having the stuff published because I would have been crawling around broke. Might have been a beat poet.
And poets into rock stars.
Then the punk rock thing happened and I looked like, you know, right in the groove, Jackson.
Performance poetry whipped crowds into a frenzy.
The entire audience just started applauding spontaneously and cheering.
Horses, horses, horses.
Created rebellious pioneers.
Sex, drugs, rock and roll, violence, you know. What more could you ask? It's all there.
And superstars who sold out stadiums.
Simply everyone's taking cocaine.
Or just sold out.
You suddenly realise that you're bought and paid for.
And opened a space for generations of unlikely outsiders to break into the mainstream.
Poetry got me everything.
As the mic is handed over to a new generation, we remember where it all began. Before the 60s really began to swing, Britain still seemed stuck in rigid traditions. Insular, grey, austere.
Britain was one culture. It was a monoculture. The businessmen really did wear bowler hats and carry furled umbrellas, and on Sundays they chained up the swings in the park so the kids couldn't use them and stuff. I mean, it's hard to imagine that.
Even the most famous poet in Britain, T.S. Eliot, looked more like a banker than a bohemian. And 4 decades after it was written, his modernist masterpiece, The Wasteland, still typified the kind of writing revered by the literary establishment.
A lot of academic poetry, which ruled the roost, was absolutely incomprehensible. You had to have read so many thousands of books and studied classical Greek and Latin before you could even begin to understand what it was about. I remember being impressed by The Wasteland and then reading about it and finding out that all the things that I thought it meant were completely the opposite. And I wanted to bring my poetry to as many people as possible.
I belong to the B generation.
The up-and-coming generation were ready for change. And a new way of engaging with poetry and audiences would come over from across the Atlantic. In the US, a wave of counterculture was transforming the country, spearheaded by the revolutionary writers of the Beat generation, who, inspired by jazz and bebop, were bringing a visionary urgency to the life and language of the street. The group's leader, outspoken gay poet Allen Ginsberg, prophesied the turmoil of the 60s in his 1955 Rage in Verse, Howl.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix.
The very name of the poem, it howls, it shouts, it is not ashamed of its volume.
It's so unashamed and unreserved, and it's just like, this is what I was doing, this is what I was thinking, this is where we were.
It had such an effect, not just in America, but also reverberated throughout Europe.
Banned after publication, Howl wasn't simply a poem read from the page. Its power came from Ginsberg standing up and declaiming his words aloud in public.
Ginsberg became the kind of signature figure in this new tradition of spoken verse expressed on stages, in bars, cafes and so on.
In 1965, one poetic generation gave way to another. T.S. Eliot, the titan of modernism, died in January. Just a few months later, beat guru Allen Ginsberg arrived in London. Barry Miles, an early admirer and pen pal of the Beat's writers, was working in an avant-garde bookshop, and one day Ginsberg paid him a visit.
The idea came of having a big poetry reading, a Beat Generation poetry reading, because there'd never been one in Britain. A lot of people knew about the Beats, but no one had actually heard them read.
10 days later, on the 11th of June, the International Poetry Incarnation was booked into the biggest concert venue in town, the Royal Albert Hall. American Beat stars Ginsberg, Gregory Corso and Lawrence Ferlinghetti headlined, alongside pacemakers of London's underground scene, like Pete Brown, Adrian Mitchell and Alexander Trocchi, who compared the event.
I am almost as surprised to see all you here as no doubt you are to see us.
Among the readers to a packed audience of 7,000 was poet Michael Horowitz.
Just getting into the hall, to our amazement, was difficult. There were milling throngs, and it was all for our gig, which we were astonished had sold out, and people were being refused entry, and they tried to refuse us entry until, with difficulty, we persuaded them we were part of the show.
Irreverent, angry, ecstatic, the poets had a platform to voice their political concerns.
And I'm waiting for the second coming, and I'm waiting for a religious revival to sweep through the state of Arizona. And I'm waiting for the grapes of wrath to be stored, and I'm waiting for them to prove that God is really American.
Made a marble phone book, carved all the names, so coat my eyes with butter, fill my ears with silver, stick my legs in plaster, tell me lies about Vietnam.
Adrian Mitchell's Tell Me Lies About Vietnam, and was seen as a highlight of this occasion. So I think that this was not only a case of the underground coming to the surface, but serious issues being expressed through the medium of poetry.
You put your bombers in, you put your conscience out, you take the human being and you twist it all about. So scrub my skin with women, chain my tongue with whiskey, stuff my nose with garlic, fill my ears with silver, stick my legs in plaster, tell me lies about Vietnam.
Mitchell and Ferlinghetti always put their money where their mouth was. They were not afraid. It was very honest, it was very real, and incredibly well delivered.
Yes! I am that worm soul.
For the first time, for a lot of people in the UK, they could hear the beat poetry, they could hear it actually being delivered by the poets themselves in the way that they intended it to, with all the cadences, all the rhythms, all the alliteration, all the metaphor, and poetry as performance.
Come sweetly now back to myself as I was.
It was quite a new concept then. Until then, poetry really was just text on a page, and this really brought it to life.
But the event's resonance went far beyond poetry and performance.
It was the beginning of the underground. There's no question about that. I mean, out of that came the art slams and the underground newspapers and the avant-garde bookshops. So this was the new youth generation that was going to change Britain. I mean, all of that all came from there. It's amazing.
One of the biggest strands of this new counterculture was, of course, pop music, led by supergroup The Beatles. That summer of '65, John Lennon and George Harrison met Allen Ginsberg in London at his 39th birthday party.
By the time they showed up, though, unfortunately, Allen was fairly drunk, and he'd taken all his clothes off. He had his underpants on his head. The first thing Lennon and Harrison did was make sure there were no photographers, of course, because that would have been a nightmare for the Beatles to have that. So I was taken with this mad, drunken poet who was naked. And they stayed for 10 minutes or 15 minutes talking, had one drink, and then they turned to go. So I asked Lennon, so why are you going so soon? And he said, you don't do that in front of the birds.
Lennon might not have been impressed by Ginsberg's antics, but behind the scenes, the Beatle was a wannabe beat poet. He had recently published 2 collections of poems and prose which drew on an experimental American tradition, but also had deep roots in English nonsense literature. That year, his new book, A Spaniard in the Works, was featured on Tonight, the BBC's flagship current affairs show.
All the tower was sleepy, crept a little boy from bed, to feign the wondrous people what lived when they were dead. He packed a little voucher for his dinner neath a tree. Perhumps a tiny dwarf or two would share a bite with me. Perchamp I'll see the Wumbalog, the highly feathered crow, the laughing, leaping Harris Tweed, and good old Uncle Joe. He packed he very trunk case, clean sockers for a week, his book and Denzel for his notes, then out the windy creep. He met him friendly magic dog, all black and curlew too, what flew him fast in second class to do what he must do.
His lyrics don't suggest supermarkets in California. He's not a beat poet in that sense. When you read his poetry, and indeed when you listen to his lyrics when he was in the Beatles, it's a very English post-war world picture.
I was bored on the 9th of October 1940 when I believe the Nasties were still booming us, led by Adolf Hitler, who only had one. Anyway, they didn't get me. I attended Tavaricus schools in Liverpool and still didn't pass, much to my auntie's surprise. As a member of the most publified Beatles, my and PG&R's record might seem funnier to some of you than this book. But as far as I'm conceived, this correction of Short Richie is the best laugh I've ever read. God help and breed you all.
I think his poetry is quite surreal in many ways. It's built on wordplay. It's quite sarcastic. It's quite acerbic. It's expressing some of the sort of darker meanings that are gathering in John Lennon's mind.
Living in, the butterfly world of pop as a Beatle, do you find that this undermines people's serious acceptance of you as a writer?
It does, but I didn't really expect them to take me seriously, so, there's nothing to say about that. They do take it more seriously than I thought, so that's good enough for me.
He was a great spearer of suits. He didn't like pretension of any kind, and he certainly wouldn't have liked the literary establishment of the day. He was probably deeply suspicious of it.
Do you think that perhaps writing a book like this and writing at all perhaps might be an unconscious attempt to win recognition in the adult world?
No, because I started all this writing long before I was a pop artist or even a Beatle or before I had a guitar. So it's nothing to do with that. The guitars came second.
And which comes first?
Well, now the guitars come first, because this is still a hobby, which it always has been.
Are you going on doing it, are you?
I'll go on doing it.
I mean, have you written anything else? Is there anything else coming after this? A third one in the series?
Well, I don't get much time. If I had more time, I'd probably write more. The publisher rang up and said, have you written anything yet? I said, no, I've been writing songs, because I can't do both at once. I've got to concentrate on the book or the songs, so I haven't written anything since this.
We'll look for it, nevertheless, John. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I think it has an amazing effect on the demographic, the poetry reading public, the readership available for contemporary poetry at the time.
In the Beatles' home city, a popular trio were also making their mark on the 60s poetry revolution. Liverpool poets Roger McGough, Brian Patton and Adrian Henry won new audiences with irreverent poems on ordinary life.
God bless all the policemen and fighters of crime. May thieves go to jail for a very long time. They've had a hard day helping clean up the town. Now they hang from the mantelpiece, both upside down. A glass of warm blood and then straight up the stairs, Batman and Robin are saying their prayers.
In 1967, the poets published The Mersey Sound, which became one of the best-selling poetry anthologies of all time. The addition of a Fender guitar on a later edition underscored the poets' musical ambitions, most notably Roger McGough with his chart-topping band, The Scaffold.
We'll drink a drink a drink a little drink a drink a drink the savior of the human race.
They were performers and they were interested in reaching a large audience, outside of those tiny rooms that they they began in. So there's a similar kind of trajectory that was probably, and a space that was probably only created for them by bands like the enormous success of bands like the Beatles. So they operated on several fronts and were obviously really super keen on putting themselves about, being visible and audible on a much, much wider stage.
This is the projectionist's nightmare. A bird finds its way into a cinema, finds the beam, flies down it, smashes into a screen depicting a garden, a sunset, and two people being nice to one another. Real blood, real intestines sliver down for likeness of a tree. This is no good, screams the audience. This is not what we came to see.
The rock and roll attitude and scathing streetwise wordplay of the Liverpool poets would influence a generation of younger writers in the making.
So they were talking about some stuff that I wasn't entirely familiar with. I was 14, 15. I got the fact they were talking about things which certainly my parents' generation considered taboo. I got the fact they were talking about social issues. And I remember that two-line poem from Roger McGough. I wanted her soft verges, but she gave me the hard shoulder. And I thought that's really clever, you know. So it was kind of, it was a stage forward in my development in terms of what I thought constituted poetry.
Traditional critics and the public were not always so impressed with the poet's breezy back-of-a-fag packet approach.
I'm interested in the modern fellas who write about pinching ice cubes from the cupboard and that kind of tribe.
I mean, I've never tried to read modern poetry at all.
Well, a lot of it, quite frankly, at my age, just doesn't make sense at all.
It's when you get such an unforeseen force which arrives on the literature scene and the scene of popular culture, it scares them. It's quite shocking. They're not asking for permission, they're simply doing it. And what the Liverpool poets did is said, you know, we're not that you need change, we are the change. We are the growth.
And one more serious short one. Very short, but it's serious. Because basically I'm very serious writing. Every day I think about dying, about disease, starvation, violence, terrorism, war, the end of the world. It helps keep my mind off things.
But despite having broken out onto TV chat shows and tour circuits, poetry still had the odds stacked against it.
The real thing about poetry and pop is that we have the audience. Pop has the audience. If the poets want the audience, they've got to come meet us. They've got to come to where we are. We haven't got to go to where they are.
Over in North America, there was one sensitive soul who was determined to take his verse to bigger rock and roll audiences.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Leonard Cohen.
The 1965 documentary film, Ladies and Gentlemen, Mr. Leonard Cohen, caught the poet on the cusp of making the break from literature to pop.
In my journey, I know I am somewhere beyond the traveling pack of poets. I will remain here until I am sure what I am leaving.
Lionised as one of Canada's brightest young talents, the 30-year-old poet from Montreal was attracting plenty of enthusiastic admirers to his readings.
His blood on my arm is warm as a bird. His heart in my hand is heavy as lead. His eyes through my eyes shine brighter than love. Oh, send out the raven ahead of the dove.
But for Cohen, this wasn't enough.
I think he realises that while he may get critical acclaim and attract small audiences as a result of his poetry and his novels, it is through music he is going to reach mass audiences.
Disappointed by his lack of financial success, Cohen became interested in New York's Greenwich Village folk scene and began setting his poems to music.
And then leaning on your windowsill, he'll say one day you caused his will to weaken with your love and warmth and shelter. And then taking from his wallet an old schedule of trains, he'll say, I told you when I came I was a stranger.
After wooing crowds with performances at festivals and anti-war rallies, Cohen released a string of successful albums, including the 1971 Songs of Love and Hate with its classic song poem, Famous Blue Raincoat.
Your famous blue raincoat was torn at the shoulder.
Her famous blue raincoat was torn at the shoulder. And that single line, you know, it's just fantastic. You know, the idea that somebody had a famous blue, it's the imbibing of backstory into something. He's a real master lyricist.
I think there's absolutely no doubt that Leonard Cohen was one of the earliest examples of the new singer-songwriter bringing autobiographical, confessional themes to the table. Instead of dealing with abstract ideas of love in pop songs, they tended to be talking about their own lives, their own experiences.
White singer-songwriters like Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan responded in poetically charged ways to a world that was in upheaval. For the black community in America, the late 60s and early 70s was a time of race riots, civil rights protests and deprivation. The tense streets of New York's Harlem would produce a harder-edged political voice that would articulate the turmoil. Gil Scott-Heron was a budding novelist and poet who had been roused by the politics and music coming out of the American South and volatile New York streets. Quitting college to write his first novel at the age of 19, he quickly realised his ability to write sophisticated words that struck a chord.
Gil Scott-Heron has got a rare ability to distill the problems of America at this time. He approaches these issues through the eyes of a black man in America, but he's able to express those ideas in a powerful and potent way and make them accessible to white audiences as well.
Well, one of Gil's many great qualities as a writer and as a performer was his ability to communicate, and his ability to often communicate quite complex and important ideas in very straightforward and unpretentious terms.
In 1971, Scott-Heron recorded his poem, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, with a backing band. His urgent spoken words condensed the simmering social tensions of the age.
I feel like I'm getting a guided tour of the society he's talking about because he is talking. And speech is such a powerful tool. It touches on a range of issues and experiences from the everyman perspective. Yeah, it's still humorous, it's a bit cheeky, it is biting, and it's weighted.
Scott-Heron's street-level poetry wasn't just confined to his own neighbourhood. In 1975, he tackled the issue of apartheid in South Africa with his song Johannesburg, but as always, in his own rousing, accessible way.
It's a brilliant dance tune, but again, I think Gil realised there are lots of ways in which you can engage audiences, and one of them is through putting serious words to sounds which also are very kind of riveting.
Somebody tell me what's the word? Johannesburg. What's the word? Johannesburg. What's the word?
What's the word? Johannesburg. And it's also about connections that we need to make with other people.
Although banned by the South African regime, the song demonstrated Scott-Heron's burning desire to address social and political injustice.
What's the word? What's the word?
The people he really wrote that for, the people in Johannesburg, that song meant so much to them, because here was this guy who was kind of just voicing his deep, deep unhappiness and anger with what was going on.
Gil Scott-Heron's unique blend of poetry, politics and percussive rhythms would sow the seeds for hip-hop and rap.
It's accessible social commentary, which is what hip-hop started out as. So it's just young people taking it upon themselves to give an honest depiction of what they see around them regardless of whether or not that form of narration is appropriated by the mainstream. So I do see links with Gil Scott-Heron and hip-hop as we know it.
While Gil Scott-Heron has been dubbed the godfather of rap, a woman poet who also came out of New York's fertile 70s music scene is often called punk's poet laureate, Patti Smith.
Her contribution to that link between performance poetry and rock and roll has just been immense. I mean, she is the figurehead.
New York is the thing that seduced me. New York is the thing that formed me. New York is the thing that deformed me. New York is the thing that perverted me. New York is the thing that converted me. And New York's the thing I love, too.
Although Patti Smith is inextricably linked to New York, it's not where she had her beginnings. Brought up in small-town New Jersey, she escaped to Manhattan in 1967 to pursue her creative ambitions.
When I lived in Chattanooga, man, or South Jersey or whatever, there was no time for daydreaming. I mean, life was simpler there. Life was simpler because, you know, we slapped the hogs, you know, we picked the peaches and all that stuff, and then you came in and you ate your supper and you thanked the Lord, and then you went to bed. It was real simple. You weren't hassled, you didn't have people trying to hold you up or goose you and stuff like that. But that's all there was. There was no chance for extension. I mean, you know, there's only so far you can daydream when you're slopping a hog.
Smith was a poet before she was a rock and roll star. By the early 70s, she was an active member of the city's famous St. Mark's Poetry Project, which had hosted legends from Auden to Ginsberg. But she also mixed with the downtown CBGB scene, where a lot of the new punk bands were emerging. Smith wanted to fuse the energy of rock and roll with her poetry and began to experiment with musicians. In 1974, her proto-punk poem Piss Factory appeared as the B-side of her debut single.
16 and time to pay off. I get this job in a piss factory, Inspector Pie.
40 hours, $36 a week, but it's a paycheck, Jack.
Piss Factory as a poem is like the precursor to Horses. I think that's where she was testing out some of these using fragments of popular song.
Shape it up, baby. Shake it up, baby.
Little words borrowed from rock and roll, and experimenting with ideas about gender. I want to smell like boys smell. Being really quite confrontational in her lyrics.
Mr. Thorpe, the time is now.
It was on Smith's first album, Horses, in 1975, recorded with a fully fledged band, that she truly hit on the fusion of poetry, performance and punk that she was searching for.
The boy gripped Johnny, he pressed him against a locker. He drove it and he drove it home, he drove it deep in Johnny. The boy disappeared.
Is she singing? Is she talking? Is she reading a poem? I can't quite tell. And I love that. I love that uncertainty. It draws you in, actually. It made it more appealing and more mysterious. So that was a huge album for me. Just listening to what you could do with spoken word in a rock idiom.
All the themes are there: sex, drugs, rock and roll, violence, you know. What more could you ask? It's all there, all in that song. And she delivers it in a way that's fiery, devotional, fierce, all like she's almost in a trance. She talks about rock and roll in almost religious terms, and that's there's sort of something quite shamanistic about the way she does that, and the poet as shaman and as rock star. She didn't need approval, she didn't need male approval, she didn't need anyone's approval, and I think that's what was so striking at that time.
The rebellious, iconoclastic energy of punk had also exploded in Britain by the late 70s, giving a voice to disempowered young people and pulling the trigger on new kinds of machine gun rhymes.
Punk was ready, it was absolutely tailor-made for performance poetry. Because it's basically, there you are, just with your voice and your ideas, you get up on stage in between the bands and you shout.
Pulled the corpse out the coal box, held back the bile, broken the next finger, I proceeded to dial. Couldn't get an ambulance, the phone was screwed, the receiver fell in half, it had been kung fu. A black belt karate cop opened up the door, demanded information about the stiff on the floor.
One poet was perfectly placed and dressed for this new British subculture. And despite his unhip beginnings performing in working men's clubs and on cabaret circuits, he would be transformed into a cultural icon. Bard of Salford, John Cooper Clarke.
For 2 years I'd looked completely anachronistic and out of date, and then the punk rock thing happened and I looked like, you know, right in the groove, Jackson. Ever since then I've been kind of known as the punk poet. You can't fight that kind of nomenclature when it's attached to you know, when it's attached by the public. You can't really fight it, there's no point. And it works in my favour, I think.
Let me be the electric heater you get pneumonia without. Let me be your setting lotion. Hold your hair with deep devotion. Deep as the deep Atlantic Ocean. That's how deep is my emotion. Deep, 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 deep. I don't want to be hers, I want to be yours.
Clarke honed a rapid-fire delivery to match punk's stripped-down aesthetic and opened for bands like the Sex Pistols and The Clash. But the crowds weren't always in the mood for poetry readings.
You know, all these people, 4,000 people, you know, these hideous, spotty cavemen in RAF overcoats banging their heads on the seats in front, you know, and they hated me. It's a very extreme experience to have 4,500 people hating you all at the same time. You couldn't do it if you didn't think you were the best thing alive. You couldn't stand up and recite poetry to people if you thought you were kind of almost as good as somebody else. I don't know about you, but I couldn't do it. You've got to think you're like the king of the world to do that kind of thing.
Somewhere in that shock of hair is this kind of gigantic jukebox of Salford, which I just find extraordinary every time I see him recite.
Outside a takeaway Saturday night, a bald adolescent asked me out for a fight. He was no bigger than a two-bob fart. He was a deft exponent of the martial arts.
He was no bigger than a tuppenny fart. He was a deft exponent of the martial arts.
He gave me 3 warnings, trod on my toes, stuck his fingers in my eyes and kicked me in the nose. A rabbit punch made my eyes explode, my head went dead, I fell in the road. I pleaded for mercy, I wriggled on the ground, he kicked me in the balls, he said something profound. Gave my face the millimetre tread, stole me chop suey and left me for dead.
You know, it's just the kind of, it's the attack in the phrase, and it's the hardness of the phrase, and which gets me.
Far from crazy pavements, the taste of silver spoons, a clinical arrangement on a dirty afternoon.
Recorded for his 1980 album Snap, Crackle and Bop, Cooper Clarke's most well-known poem, Beasley Street, took inspiration from the Busby Berkeley musical 42nd Street while documenting the experience of inner-city decay.
They're writing about an exciting Manhattan neighbourhood. I couldn't do that from any experience, so I thought I'll go to the other extreme. I'll write about some scabby, low-rent ghetto that everybody's been to. You know, all over the world people identify with that.
The dirt blows out, the dust blows in, you can't keep it neat. It's a fully furnished dustbin, 16 Beasley Street. People turn to poison quick as lager turns to piss. Sweethearts are physically sick every time they kiss. It's a sociologist's paradise. Each day repeats, uneasy, cheesy, greasy, queasy, beastly Beasley Street.
I've always tried to deal with the eternal things in life. Disappointment, loss, aspiration. The dichotomy between aspiration and actuality, These things bedevil the human spirits, generation in, generation out.
John Cooper Clarke was a trailblazer. The grit and gall of his performance poetry paved the way for a whole new generation.
The first poet I ever saw live was Cooper Clarke, and I saw him supporting Susie and the Banshees. So the very fact that someone could get on stage with a band and it was just a bloke from Manchester, and I sat and watched him and the crowd loved it, and it was just magnificent, this guy. I never thought that you could do that. And Clarkey opened the door for everybody else.
Keen to get up on stage and have a go at the way Britain was being run in the early 1980s, were the Ranters. Star rant poet of the moment was Essex boy Attila the Stockbroker.
And here's more news that's really hot. J.R. Ewing is a trot. Neil Diamond's playing Angola. And Marx invented Coca-Cola. Western values fade and die as red successes multiply. Arthur Miller isn't dead. He's writing radio plays instead. And as the bastions crash and fall, here comes the greatest blow of all. It took a long time to deduce, but Reagan's really Lenny Bruce.
At the very best, you had to grab the attention of the audience and it would go brilliantly and they'd love it. I mean, I did some amazing gigs in the early days, say just doing 5 minutes supporting the Jam, going down brilliantly. But the other extreme, you know, you get a bunch of boneheads in there, and it's just you, and they're starting Sieg Heiling and they're shouting commie and all the rest of it, and then there's a row, because I wouldn't back down from a row if there was going to be one coming my way. So the whole point was the immediacy and the directness and the self-confidence of it.
In spite of the violent clashes, poets like Attila were making genuine connections with crowds on the deep social unrest affecting them all. One of his most popular poems, Contributory Negligence, fantasised about being a hitchhiker picked up by a judge who'd made headlines in 1982 for releasing a rapist.
He asked for it. He's rich and snobbish, right-wing, racist, sexist too, brain-dead, stupid, sick and slobbish, should be locked in London Zoo. He wanted me to beat him up. It was an open invitation. Late at night he picked me up, an act of open provocation.
After the fifth verse, right, he wanted me to beat him up. It was an open invitation. Late at night he picked me up, an act of open provocation. The entire audience just started applauding spontaneously and cheering. It just struck a chord. And that, at its best, that is what performance poetry can do. That's what, yeah, this is why it irritates me so much. All these, you know, I mean, I'm completely persona non grata in the sort of literary poetry world. You know, they see us as poets at all, popular poets or whatever, you know. But what have they got? They've got some slim volume with some, you know, anally retentive prat sort of pouring over this, oh, wonderful syntax, powerful image. We got whole audiences standing up cheering, you know. I mean, forget it, you know. It's 1-0 to the Ranters.
Nigel wants to go to C&A's, but the lifts are full of Albanian footballers. And Nigel doesn't like Albanian footballers. Nigel wants to go to C&A's, but they've started serving Kentucky Fried Chicken in C&A's, and Nigel doesn't like rats! Nigel wants to go to C&A's, but the menswear department is full of existentialists. And Nigel doesn't like existentialists, not even part-time ones. Nigel wants to go to C&A's, but I don't understand why, because they don't sell nerve gas in C&A's, not even to SDP members in cashmere sweaters.
If you're going to make art, that to me is the most valid reason to make it, because you've got a perspective that you don't think anybody else has. And Attila certainly does have that. And he has a wicked sense of humour to go with it as well, you know. And he has the ability to get hold of an issue and tickle it, but also throw it at you. So it hits you in a different way than it normally would. And, you know, you have to admire that.
Rant poets like Attila weren't the only ones to mine the vein of discontent in Britain's youth subcultures. Dub reggae-inspired poet Benjamin Zephaniah turned the spotlight onto his black immigrant experience in the early 80s.
This policeman keep on kicking me to death. Hey, this policeman, well, this policeman keep on kicking me to death.
This policeman keep on kicking me to death.
Like a thief in the dark, him take me to the place where him just left. And when him get me, him there, him just kicking me to death. This policeman keeps on kicking me to death.
It's absolutely beautiful, because it's almost as if it's happening. This policeman keep on kicking me to death. You know, boom.
Him beat me so badly, I dip on the floor. Him said, if I don't plead guilty, him gon' kick me more. I was feeling sick. I pleaded racist attack. And another pig come to finish me off. And this one was black.
This is what ranting at its very best does. It puts across an important political point, but in a way that is really, really funny. Phil Jupitus, for instance, who as Porky the Poet, I mean, I gave his first gig to him. The one I most remember with Pork's first gig, I'm sure he did it then, was They've All Grown Up in the Beano, Dennis the Menace Has Got Pubic Hair. You know, he was great.
They've all grown up in the Beano. Dennis the Menace has got pubic hair. Biffo is well into anarchy now. He's more of a punk than a bear. Lord Snooty is a High Court judge taking bribes through a Zurich bank. Had a run-in with the Inland Revenue when he sold Bunkerton Castle to a Yank. Grandpa is at last 6 foot under. Roger the Dodger's in the SPG, now dodging charges for murder, but Lord Snooty will help him, you'll see. The 3 bears are on racks in Harrods because Hanky shot them at last, and teacher was thrown out of Bash Street for being too pissed when in class. I suppose it was in the wake of punk, that sensibility that you could do anything. You know, and once Attila got me on stage, that door opened suddenly, and it was like, oh, I could perform. And so then you think, right, I've got to perform. He does about 20 minutes when I see him, so I need 20 minutes of poems. So then you just start writing. Way back when Blondie caused a fuss with height that was preposterous, announced a tour fortuitous, my ticket bought miraculous. I made my trip alone and thus with manner somewhat tremulous and hairstyle quite erroneous, cut by my mum so dubious and dermal state disastrous, plus fashion sense iniquitous, for punk rock too punctilious, teen hipster supercilious.
When you see someone like Phil Jupitus, who had been working at the DHSS, you know, he wrote from that perspective, and he tried to put that across. You know, his poetry wasn't the poetry of Wordsworth or Shakespeare. You know, it was much more the poetry of the sort of failed school leaver, of which there were and are many.
I was not as shouty and angry as the others, which is the difference. You know, I liked the sort of the light and shade a bit more. I like a bit of rage when it's in the right place, but it makes me laugh too much. I'm too giggly for anger these days.
Tinder, Facebook, isn't this a thing?
Yeah, comedy's in really good shape.
By the 90s, Porky had left poetry, becoming better known as a stand-up comedian and primetime TV star. This was the height of Cool Britannia. Comedy had taken on the supercharged, stadium-sized ambitions of rock and roll. And poetry, too, was invited to the party. In the summer of 1997, headlines announced the arrival of an unknown superstar, furnished with the biggest advance ever seen for a poet.
When Murray Lachlan-Young burst onto the scene with a record deal purported to be however much it was purported to be, our hearts as poets leapt with joy. Because what is good for one poet is good for all poets.
Foppish and flamboyant, the 28-year-old's witty social observations on London's glitterati quickly marked him out to A&R men looking for the next big thing.
Well, I saw Auntie Millie in last season's clothes. She said car, house and yacht had gone straight up her nose. But she'd had the most wonderful time, and the whole thing seemed simply sublime. I said, Millie, my dear, you'll be dead at this rate. Not at all, parried she, for I've just had a plate made of metal put into my nose. And now she's hoovering it back up like a hose. Simply everyone's taking cocaine. Well, I saw Uncle Bert.
Murray Lachlan Young didn't just satirise the appetites and attitudes of the 90s from the sidelines. He threw himself headlong into the decade's heady, have-it-all madness.
And you would dance just the same if you'd hoofed a whole G.
What happens when you sign a record deal of that kind of magnitude? You suddenly realise that you're bought and paid for. You know, you're a corporate bitch to some extent. There was something nihilistic about what I was doing, and I knew it. You know, I was just going for it. I was just going for it as far as it could possibly go, and I didn't care. And I knew there was probably disaster at the end of it, but I was just going to do it.
I mean, who knows what poetry is? But I would say that Murray Lachlan Young. Sorry, I touched your bottom.
No, that's okay. That's the perks of the job. If a poet can't touch your ass during an interview, what's the point of coming out?
I'd say Murray Lachlan Young is.
Oh, grow up! You know I meant leaving the house.
Faster than a speeding bullet. The supermodel had a super night. At the super restaurant, it was such a super sight when she super danced at the super nightclub with the super people wearing super clothes to the super tunes of the super DJ. And then, for the world's press, she superposed. And when
By the end of the year, Lachlan Young had his own Taylor, MTV deal and BBC Christmas special to accompany his album, Vice and Verse.
It's been really wicked. It's quite an interesting document because it does actually show me in that suit at that time, you know, with God knows how many tens of thousands of quid being spent on that production.
Where is my leopard skin stretched limousine? Where is the stuff of my star-studded dream? Where is my villa in the south of France? And where are all those sexy girls who meet me just by chance?
But just as poetry had hit the big time, cracks in the act were beginning to show.
And where are the keys to my Bentley Corniche?
I think I realised during that show how brittle my stage angle was. And for me, as somebody whose ego had, you know, swollen to the size of a small town, or maybe even a small city, that sudden realisation that not everybody thought that I was fabulous was a bit hard to take.
Give me now your goatee beard. Hand it over. Give it here. Let me hold it in my hand. Chinny, goatee, beardy man. Give it up. Give it in. Or put it in a beard-sized tin and leave it by the barber's door because you know it is not yours, goatee man.
The moment that programme happened, your heart sunk. You realised that there would be no record companies calling up other poets for deals, and I think that had a kind of big effect. Nobody would touch a poet after that.
Soon after his Vice and Verse show, Murray and EMI had parted company on bad terms. With disappointing album sales, he disappeared into the wilderness. Spoken word was in the doldrums, but in the mid-90s, an explosive new movement of poetry arrived in the UK from America. Intense and immediate, poetry slams pitted aspiring poets from all backgrounds against each other in order to win over audiences with their work.
I mean, the whole idea of poetry slams is really good, because if you've got a talent for words, then that is a great way of actually honing your skill. And now there's this whole ready-made scene out there for people to take advantage of, which obviously encourages people with those skills to actually start doing it because they know there's an automatic place they can go.
I want to see unbuttoned shirts to knickers, circling chests with the tips of your fingers. I want hands on, lips on.
Poetry slams help give up-and-coming writer Holly McNish an access point into performing her work. Her raw, personal poems quickly resonated beyond the competitions.
Giving head 2 shouts and no sweat, no.
When you get like a bit of an underground current of poetry or lyrics and music, it's so exciting, and it still is, because we're still so
bloody closed about our thoughts and feelings. It took me 8 weeks to get the confidence to go into town. Now the comments around me cut like a knife as I rush into toilet cubicles feeling nothing like nice. And I'm not trying to parade this. I don't want to make a show. But when I'm told I'd be better just staying at home, and when another friend I know is thrown off a bus and another mother told to get out of a pub, even my grandma said maybe I was sexing it up. So you sort of realise that everyone's quite vulnerable and everyone's quite sort of like wanting more, and it's just nice. It's like broken to a lot of prejudices that I didn't think I had, but obviously everyone does.
A short biography of the Singer Man. The Singer Man, born in 1903, has lived in Spalding, in Lime Tree Grove, in a village called Rim.
Jamaican-born poet Kai Miller, who has won the prestigious Forward Poetry Prize, has also been a star of the slam poetry scene. His inspiration comes not only from the energy of the stage, but from the ecstatic language of religious meetings.
Church was a huge thing of learning how language worked and how language affects people and how you can make language magical. That's why mountains shivered, that's why they fell, that's why stones shouted.
If it was the song, but there was no rock so strong to resist the fourth accented beat, that huh in the Singer Man's song.
The poet who seems to be on stage and seems to risk something and risk something of themselves, I think that always draws us in a little bit more.
See, they learned that respect comes from striking the pose that demands it. But I know respect and fear are not compatible. A long way from bat and ball. They don't play, they let daggers fall from blood-soaked fingers while their siblings lie bleeding in hallways dead. But like wisdom has always said, blood begets blood and keeps spilling. So the pavements are stained and our hearts are grief-stricken.
Kate Tempest is so interesting. She's like a proper performance poet in that she weaves a narrative. So she's obviously speaking to her generation that listened to grime, that listened to rap. She can rap, so she moves between rapping and performance poetry.
Poets like Kate Tempest are like flares. They fire up out of the ground at night from nowhere, up into the sky, and then light.
We can rampage till we stand strange. Right now we got our hands chained, clutching at freedom. You know, the freedom of mean what you say and say it with meaning. We need to change our own minds before we try and change the sequence. We need to live with our energy, not by our reason. Look, this the last day of my discontented season. No more will I tolerate this greed, it's the meaning.
I think the use of rhyme, the way rhyme is played upon, the way she plays with imagery, specific forms of wordplay that are just kind of very lyrical. I think that's what makes her stuff initially very captivating.
His arms were bound in the feathers of his father's
Inspired by mythology, the South Londoner's storytelling skills have marked her out to both young and older audiences.
He heard the wind speak every time he felt his wings beat. His father flew before him, and so the course was set. He said, don't fly by the waves, because your wings will get wet. But don't fly so high that the sun...
The poem Icarus updates the ancient Greek legend for contemporary life.
Or Icarus.
Even though you might know that myth and you might know that story, there's something in the way that she tells it that it's new, and you're rethinking and thinking again about, well, what it means. What is that relationship between the father and the son when the son wants to break out and do something for himself?
I wonder what he saw before he fell, and if he needed my help, would he have asked for it? Probably he wouldn't. Probably he thought he was invincible. He weren't. In principle, he burned. He smouldered in those myths, so that we who never flew before can learn from what he did.
You can read it on the page, but it's not until she performs it live that you get the full three-dimensional soundscape of it.
You were born for greatness, you can believe that, you can know it, you can take it from the tears of the poets. See, there's always been heroes, and there's always been villains. And yes, the stakes may have changed, but really there's no difference. There's always been heartbreak and grief.
Embraced by literary establishment and music critics alike, Tempests won both poetry prizes and a Mercury Award nomination for her album. Her future seems set as one of the most successful artists of her generation.
It's her time, you know, and how long her time will last, whether she will decide to become a playwright, you know, first and foremost, whether she'll become a serious page poet. She's got everything open to her at the moment, which is great to see.
Tempest continues to take her cue from her ancestors, but adapted for her own generation.
I think she's brilliant. She's one of those poets that every time you listen or read her poem, you find something that you didn't find before. It's kind of like the beat poets in that way, I think.
I do feel that Kate Tempest is the next incarnation of the beats. She's the poetry incarnation of now.
"50 years on, the Beats spirit is being officially celebrated at the Poetry Reincarnation, remembering the 1965 event that made poetry a powerful part of popular culture.
And Zeus laughed and laughed and spat out deadly gases from his guts.
Yes, I was there. I was very young. It was my apprenticeship.
A new generation of performers are standing up alongside British beat poets from the day, like Pete Brown and Michael Horowitz, who also organised this year's stellar gathering.
The event in the Roundhouse today is not only to recall what happened in '65, but to demonstrate how much has improved. More and more poets becoming musicians and vice versa, or including each other, and more women being involved and absolutely having equal voice.
Carry on doing our writing, carry on doing our reading, carry on reading, carry on writing as you were and as you are. Or the big mouths dribble all over the big table and decide amongst themselves who we are and why we do this. It's a weird life, poetry.
We've changed. We are multicultural. And that's why tonight is good, because it's got that proper male-female racial mix, which is absolutely vital for culture, you know, for real culture.
This is called Howl 2.0. I saw you fall apart in front of the sea and the stars, sipping confidence from a plastic pint glass, so at odds with yourself and unable to ask for help. You are in love with the normality of everyone else.
And the original energy of performance poetry and its rock and roll spirit is still being carried into the future.
Human beings have a very profound gift for communication. And for that reason, spoken poetry is a really powerful thing. It's all about word, sound, power. The word is the concept, you give it sound and it takes on a new power.
We own this, don't we own our days?
That's where the real fire is, you know. The 1960s were probably the best time for poets as rock and roll, pop culture icons. Except for now. Now poetry is stronger, more powerful, more present, more dynamic than it's ever been since the beginning of time.